I love that woman. She's so great. Thank you, Laura. It's great to be here. I've got 3 things I want to do. First, I'm going to talk about energy. I'm going to talk about how energy works. I'm going to talk about how energy can build a new world. And the way I'm going to do that is focus on a couple of media issues. I thought war would be a good one, religion would be a good one, politics. So I got about 20 minutes. We're going to hit those. And if we don't finish, you can come to my session on Saturday morning. We'll mop up whatever we don't cover tonight. How's that? So we're going to solve all the world's problems. You ready? We better go slow to go fast, though. So let's start by breathing. And in doing so, let's look at how the energy dynamic in inhaling and exhaling works, because it's very fundamental to everything we're going to be talking about for the next 20 minutes. So I'm going to ask you to do this with me first. I'm going to ask you to take a deep breath and hold it, and then just hold it, and I'll tell you what to do next. No one's going to expire here tonight, I promise. And then we'll go from there. So on the count of 3, ready? Take a deep breath and hold it. Ready? All right, so that felt pretty good, I'm guessing. And the longer I stand here and run my mouth and take my time telling you what to do next, the more uncomfortable you're starting to feel, right? A little anticipating some pain, a little discomfort, right? Right? Yeah. Let it out. So did you hear that breath of relief? Okay, so let's rewind the tape here. So first, it started out, it felt pretty good, and then it didn't feel good anymore, and then you got some relief. But if we were to stop there, what would be the next thing that you would anticipate or experience? Help me out. Say in? You need to breathe in. Why? Because what do you need? Exactly. So one of the beauties of this approach is its simplicity. So we're going to break down these meanings. We're going to break down the complexity that we just heard Laura talk about by looking at something that I actually believe in my heart of hearts is a way to accelerate consciousness on the planet. If you get how this works, you get how all polarities work. First of all, a polarity is an interdependent pair, okay? They show up as a pair. That's just how they show up. You can't have one without the other. They rely on each other to exist, and they both contribute to a higher purpose that both of the values share. So when you're doing inhaling and exhaling really well, it leads you to thrive. Is everyone getting this so far? Good. All right. So what we want to do is we want to look at this from the standpoint of our thinking. How do we address our problems and complexities today? One is through either-or thinking, which involves independent alternative. What suit do I wear today? What pair of shoes? What time do I go? These are all either-or independent alternatives. And we can't get through our day without it. It gives us science, it gives us language, it gives us technology. This is great stuff. But if we over-focus on problem-solving thinking, we end up with polarization, which is incomplete analysis and unsustainable outcomes. And we see that playing out in all these different memes. So what we want to do is we want to appreciate that there are certain things that show up in our societies, in our human systems, that are inherently unsolvable by their very nature. And our trying to solve them, as if we could, is probably one of the things that gets us in the most trouble. So what we want to do is we want to appreciate those unsolvable polarities that are there, and they're always going to be there. And we want to look at the benefits of applying a both-and lens to those. And we will also want to appreciate that we don't want to get into the tyranny of the and, which is trying to make everything a both-and, because that would get us in trouble too. And so we want to look at highly efficient and effective thinking that taps into appreciating what are the problems we need to solve and what are the interdependent polarities that are at play that we can only leverage but we can't solve. So when we try to treat a polarity as a problem to solve, this is what it looks like. It's accurate, but it's not complete. So technically that's true, it's right, it's accurate, but it's not complete. The same thing is true here. We can make a pretty good argument that this is the right answer at a certain point in time. But if we rely on either-or thinking in the context of this tension, it's not going to be sustainable. So we're going to look at how these play out in the exact same way with other tensions. So when we look at war, for instance, we look at this tension between what we experience as peace, the desire for peace and the need for war, and what Martin Luther King talks about around we must not just not wage war, we have to love peace and sacrifice for it. So where does that sacrifice come from? It comes from us standing up for certain beliefs that are important to us as individuals in the collective. So there's an inherent tension there that's not going away. So when you look at our major religions on the planet, every single one of them has at their core some recognition of justice, rules and law, and the need for grace and love and mercy. So which is it? Are we loved unconditionally, or do we have to follow the rules? The answer to all polarities is yes. When we look at this the same way we look at the breathing metaphor, rules, justice, laws give us protection, accountability. It helps us prepare and be safe, a lot at the lower level of the Maslow scale. But if we over-focus on, and by the way, this is true of every polarity, if you over-focus on any pole of a polarity to the neglect of its pair, you will get the downside of the overemphasized pole. Anytime, every time, over time, all the time. It's just how they work. So if you over-focus on that pole of this polarity to the neglect of the other one, it will lead to you being perceived as punitive. You will do heinous acts with self-righteous indignation, and you'll be accused of being the world's police force. Sound familiar? All right, so if that's the problem, well, then the solution is, well, then we need to be more loving and forgiving, and we need to focus on diplomatic solutions and humanitarian aid. Now, that may be a necessary self-correction if you're down there, but as a solution, it's a setup. Because what do we know about how polarities work? Anytime you over-focus on one pole to the neglect of the interdependent pair, you get the downside of the overemphasized pole anytime, every time, all the time, over time. That's just how they work. So, here you are, tolerating abuse. There's no accountability. And now, instead of the world's police force, you're the world's aid force and source. How's that working for you? Not too well. Okay, well, then we're back where we started. So when we look at this notion of the greater purpose around affirming peace and avoiding war and disaffirming peace and promoting war, you can see that there are two necessary upsides that those poles represent in service of the higher purpose. This is actually, truth be told, one energy system. But it has two necessary pieces that are differentiated and part of the system that have to be paid attention to. So if you look at it strictly from an either-or perspective, just like the breathing, you could be this ultra-spiritual guy down here, but for a lot of people that's not going to be okay. They tend to hold this justice, rules, and law pole. Okay, they may work at the Pentagon, or they may do other types of activities that are in service of this very important benefit. So you've got a value and fear combination here that technically is correct and necessary and useful, but on its own isn't sustainable. When you look at this, it's the same as this. Now, what happens is, if you are looking at this pole of the polarity as a solution, it creates vulnerability for this downside. And so if you want to know how you get there, that's how. Whenever you tie success to one pole, you get the downside of the overemphasized pole. So then that looks like the solution, but what we have to be aware of, particularly in this community, is that this as a solution could also lead to its own downside, which is ultra-spiritual guy. So the question is, how do we hold the pole of preference? Because we all have preferences, and these preferences are useful, and we have to make choices without associating ourselves so much with an either-or perspective that we end up generating resistance in the very things we're trying to avoid. That's the question that polarity thinking tries to answer. We're trying to avoid the setup that ends up getting us in trouble the same way it gets others in trouble. So, we've got this as one way to frame and to use polarity thinking as a way to frame the tension between justice and mercy. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of just politics is the part and whole polarity. If you want to commit one polarity to memory, it would be this one. Whenever we talk about the benefits of the part, and you can think about yourself as the part right now, just think of what you want and appreciate and need. Everybody wants freedom. Everyone wants uniqueness. Everybody wants to use their own initiative, to follow their own passions. And that's a great thing. And we all benefit when we pursue equality and connectedness and synergy of the parts, because we get more than the sum when we do. This is what we call a virtuous cycle, when we're getting the best of both upsides and we're minimizing the downsides. So if we over-focus on freedom and uniqueness and initiative to the neglect of the whole, and we might want to pay attention to this in the United States, because on the planet, we are probably, next to Australia, the most individualistic nation in terms of our values than any other nation, which is why we tolerate what we now have, which is new categories of rich, fabulously wealthy, super rich, shrinking middle class, and the poor. When you see and hear inequality, isolation, lack of coordination, and fighting between the parts, those are hallmarks of an overfocus on the part to the neglect of the whole. So if you're there, the upside of the whole looks like a pretty good solution for equality and connectedness and synergy. But as a solution in and of itself, it can get us in trouble. That actually also triggers a fear of the loss of freedom and sameness and excess conformity. So when we look at how that plays out, when we do these vicious pendulum swings every 4 or 8 years, and we vilify each other, and we create dramas, and depending on which channel you turn, you've heard the story. And we just look how that plays out. It can play out this way, and this is what I want to just highlight around the benefits of this particular approach, because it's really, when you look at that, you might think, well, you've got to balance the two. We're setting the bar too low. Balance is a little of this and a little of this. What we're after and where we can set the bar is with a disproportionate benefit from both upsides in service of the higher purpose and a minimization of the downsides. The more people in the system who can see how the dynamic works, the easier it will be to get there. But if all we have is an either-or lens to all these tensions, we are forever going to be stuck. Now, at one level, democracy helps us to shift between these poles of emphasis, but it's still done in predominantly an either-or thinking way. Our founders looked at this and had it central to our founding. We hear the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Trying to avoid inequality, loss of freedom. 100 years later, very difficult time in our history, where our own values were being put to the test. We hear it again from Abraham Lincoln 77 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. About 100 years later, we get the I Have a Dream speech. The arc of the moral universe is long, is it not? But it bends towards justice. Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last, and I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands in the way of love. And the beautiful articulation of that quote at the memorial is perfectly situated on a polarity map. The downside of an overuse of power, reckless and abusive. A downside of overfocus on love, sentimental and anemic. Love implementing the demands of justice, power correcting everything that stands against love. The higher purpose is justice, and there's a recognition that either one of those issues, reckless and abusiveness, sentimental and anemic, is just naivete. And we have the choice, and we have the power to tap into the best of both upsides if we seize it. This is a free energy system, by the way. It doesn't cost us anything. It's free. It's available. It's like sunlight. It's like gravity. It's just waiting for us to tap into. So we all need to hold each other accountable, and we all need to forgive. So justice and mercy is a core element. If I were to pick the 5 most important polarities, this would be one of them. And it's no different from how this energy system runs. Inhale and exhale work. It's just the feedback loop is a little bit longer. If you don't take care of this every minute, you're going to be in big trouble. But the longer these feedback loops are, and how these larger, how these larger tensions work and shift, the more difficult they are to see. But that's changing. There's a lot of literature out there that's given us air cover out there talking about paradox, wicked problems, competing values, tensions, polarities, contradictions, dualities. The list just goes on and on. There's an awareness of this importance of interdependency. And we supplement either or thinking with both hand thinking. I do believe it will help people at different levels avoid trying to have arguments that essentially are no different from this one. We have killed or maimed over 100 million of each other in the last century alone over questions that are not that different from this one right here. So when we see and hear these issues around, are we free, or do we pursue freedom or equality, and you hear the different stories and the different values and fears playing out, we can hold a space for them. Creating the new world involves holding a space for people at these different levels, appreciating that there are values and fears at play. You know, and they're legitimate at one level. And so it's up to us to be able to, when we hear them framed up as this either or, trying to avoid these downsides and trying to achieve these upsides, some people will never tolerate even the hint of that. And there's wisdom in that. It's fear, but there's wisdom in that. And there's benefit to what they're going after. And we need to make sure to hold everybody accountable for the over-toleration of the limitations of those particular pole values. And we need to do it on both sides of the house. Laura was talking about the Occupy movement and the fear of a declining democracy based solely really on the fear of big money and big corporations and seeking equality and connectedness and synergy. It's a very laudable effort. And it has to own the over-tolerance of its limitations as well. And from an either-or perspective, those downsides can be just as heinous. If you've only got an either-or perspective to work from, every polarity ends up being a potential train wreck. And it often feels that way, does it not? So, as we look at our Tea Party friends seeking freedom, uniqueness, and initiative for job creators and avoiding the big government, we can see that there's a legitimate point of view there. From a polarity perspective, we use resistance as a resource for change and for dialogue. They're going to advocate for deregulation. Occupy Wall Street, fear is big money, corporations, and they want to seek equality, and they want to regulate to avoid raping the planet and doing other exploitative moves related to exploiting people, perhaps. So when deregulation is emphasized in order to empower that pole to the neglect of regulating appropriately, what can happen is it leads to a financial crisis. But the feedback loop is sometimes several years. So the financial crisis then results in increased regulation, which is resisted, and then the government ends up buying GM, and then who complains about the government buying GM is the very people who were advocating for the deregulation to begin with that caused the financial crisis to begin with, which resulted in the government buying GM. It's a little harder to see because the feedback loop's longer, but feedback loops are getting shorter, and people are starting to make the connection. So we're actually in a really good place to build a new world, I think, if we can begin to illuminate for people how these energy systems work and how we're contributing to vicious cycles when we, for either pole, treat the polarity as a problem to solve because the only thinking default we have is either or. And then just as a final sort of coming in for a landing here, we all have a way to play a part in this. And when you think about capitalism normally focuses at the organizational level. Keep in mind the part and whole polarity, freedom, uniqueness, initiative, and the team around the collective, equality, connectedness, and synergy. When that polarity is leveraged well, it's a stronger team. Now the team is the part, and the next level of system is the whole. Every team is seeking freedom, uniqueness, and initiative. Every organization is seeking equality and connectedness and synergy to help the organization run efficiently. When that polarity is leveraged well at that part and whole level, it's a more successful organization. Now the organization is the part, and maybe the local community is the whole. So we've got a way to break this down, and we can actually measure. We've got technology and methods of measuring multiple polarities in systems at each of these levels. So when you hear about conscious capitalism, this is a very important sign that we are starting to move into a place where even the evil corporations, some of them, recognize that not only are they a whole, but they're also a part at all these other levels of system. And we as individuals need to vote with our dollars and support those organizations. Because every single one of us is a part in a larger whole, and we can contribute, and we have more power than we think. When I work with the U.S. military, they talk about their passion for the country. And they talk about that passion as, we're representing the nation, we're representing everybody. But even the U.S. military is starting to recognize that they're a part of a larger system. And it's to all of their benefit to pay attention to those as well. So I'm seeing a lot of good news out there, in spite of a lot of the frustration around the polarization that we experience. And I'm having fun with Laura, having conversations with people and exploring training around people who tend to hold very dearly to certain poles of certain polarities and are able to see with new eyes how these tensions work, and to be able to have different conversations about how they respond when they experience them. So I guess the way I'd like to end is with one of my favorite polarity-focused kind of, it's not really a quote, it's kind of a benediction, it's a Franciscan benediction. And I think you'll hear the polarities in there. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you can deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice and freedom and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and war, so that you can reach out your hand and comfort them and turn their pain into joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. Thank you.